A pale autumn sun filtered through the kitchen window of the old Hale house, washing the wooden counter in a cold glow. Robert Hale, 72, stood by the kettle waiting for it to boil. The house was silent, except for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the wind brushing against the lemon tree outside. The phone rang. Its sharp tone cut through the quiet. He hesitated before picking it up. "Dad," came David's voice, brisk, cheerful, and slightly forced. "Good news. We found a buyer for the house, someone who'll pay more than the market price. It's time, Dad." Robert didn't answer right away. He looked out the window. A leaf fell, spinning slowly toward the damp soil. From the background, Marianne's voice broke in shrill, impatient. "We can't keep delaying this, Robert. The longer you wait, the less it's worth. You don't even use most of the rooms anymore." Robert lifted the kettle and poured hot water into his cup, steam rising like ghosts between them. "I didn't know," he said softly, "that memories had a market price." A pause, just long enough to feel the distance between blood and loyalty. "Dad, don't start with that sentimental stuff," David muttered. "You're not getting any younger." Robert set the cup down, his fingers steady. "I suppose that's true," he said. "But neither is the house." He ended the call, the click echoing through the kitchen. For a moment, all he heard was the slow ticking again. Outside, the lemon tree swayed, shaking loose two small fruits that rolled across the soil. Robert stared at them and whispered, "If they want to sell the house, let's see if the house agrees." Morning stretched thin across the Hale property, draping the small wooden house in a quiet amber light. After hanging up the phone, Robert stepped out onto the porch. The air smelled of wet leaves and old paint. The boards beneath his slippers groaned softly, a language he'd learned over decades of repairs. From the porch, he could see the lemon tree, their lemon tree standing proud at the edge of the garden. Its leaves were thinning, but it still carried fruit. Ellen had planted it 40 years ago, insisting that every home needs a bit of sunlight it can grow. He smiled faintly at the memory, then turned back inside. The living room felt like a museum of his life. Faded photos lined the mantel, one of him and Ellen on their wedding day, her veil catching the coastal wind. Another of David, still a boy, holding a hammer far too big for his hands. On the coffee table sat a porcelain teapot, chipped but clean, beside a folded newspaper. The house was filled with silence, not loneliness exactly, but a sound that carried all the voices that used to fill it. He poured himself another cup of tea and glanced at the calendar. October 12th, Ellen's birthday. He almost laughed. "You'd probably scold me for letting the curtains fade," he murmured. The cat Moss jumped onto the windowsill and blinked at him, unbothered by sentiment or time. 2 days later, David arrived with Marianne. They didn't call ahead. They never did anymore. The SUV door slammed hard enough to startle the birds from the tree. Robert watched from the window as they approached, their matching sunglasses, their clipped steps, their impatience barely disguised as concern. "Dad," David said as soon as the door opened, "we're just here to talk. Don't get defensive." "I'm not," Robert replied. "I'm just surprised you found the time." Marianne forced a smile. "We've been busy. The firm's expanding, and we thought it'd be smart to settle things early. Before winter hits." Robert didn't answer. He led them to the kitchen. The kettle started again, obedient as ever. They sat, David tapping his phone, Marianne scrolling through emails. The smell of lemon tea filled the room. "So David began, Marianne's been talking to a broker. The house could sell for nearly $800,000 if you signed soon. You could move somewhere smaller, more manageable." Robert stirred his tea. "Smaller than this? Come on, Dad. You live alone. It's too much space for one person." "I seem to manage," Robert said quietly. Marianne leaned forward, her tone sharpening. "We're not trying to take anything from you. We just think it's practical." "Practical," Robert repeated like the word was a riddle. "That's what Ellen said when she planted that tree instead of buying new curtains." David sighed. "You're stuck in the past. Mom's gone. This house, it's just walls now." Robert looked up, his eyes clear. "Then maybe you should stop trying to live inside it." The silence that followed was thick enough to hear the kettle hiss behind it. Marianne stood. "We'll give you time, but please think about it." "I already have," Robert said. When the door closed, the clock resumed its ticking as if it had been waiting for the argument to end. That afternoon, Emma arrived. Her small sedan hummed up the gravel driveway, music spilling faintly from the open window. She stepped out carrying a grocery bag and her smile. "Grandpa." "You didn't answer my text," she said. You're not hiding from civilization again, are you? Maybe I am, he replied, grinning. But civilization always finds me, usually in an SUV. She laughed and hugged him. Dad came by, huh? You could tell? She pointed at the driveway. He always parks like he's angry at the ground. They spent the next hour in the garden. Emma raked fallen leaves while Robert repaired the hinge on the gate. When she finished, he handed her a lemon from the tree. Still good, she asked, squeezing it gently. Still ours, he said. Your grandmother planted it when we had nothing but a loan and a dream. She said if we could keep a lemon tree alive in Oregon, we could survive anything. Emma smiled. Looks like you did. Not sure about the survive anything part, he murmured. She didn't press him. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind only shared by people who understand grief without having to name it. That evening, after Emma left, Robert sat in his study. The old desk was scarred with decades of scratches and ink stains. He opened the middle drawer and reached inside. His fingers brushed against a yellowed envelope marked in Ellen's handwriting, Independence. He unfolded the letter slowly, afraid it might crumble. If they ever try to take the house, remember it's more than bricks. It's proof that love leaves roots. Don't let them trade roots for numbers. His throat tightened. Outside, the wind had started to pick up, rustling through the lemon tree like a whisper of approval. He placed the letter back into the envelope and locked it away. Then he turned off the lamp, leaving only the soft glow from the window. The lemon tree shimmered under the porch light. Ellen, he whispered, I think I'll need your help again. Rain began sometime after midnight, tapping softly against the roof. Robert lay awake in his chair, the letter from Ellen still on the desk beside him. The smell of lemon peel lingered on his fingers. He didn't bother turning on the light. The shadows knew him well enough. He could hear the slow dripping from the porch, each drop marking a thought he didn't want to have. Maybe they're right, he whispered to no one. Maybe it's time to let go. But the moment he imagined strangers walking through the house, rearranging the furniture, repainting Ellen's kitchen, something inside him clenched tight. The idea felt like betrayal, not just to her, but to everything they'd built. He rose and walked to the window. The garden glowed faintly beneath the street lamp. The lemon tree swayed its branches heavy with fruit. He thought of Ellen standing there years ago in her gardening gloves, laughing at his poor pruning skills. You cut as if you're afraid the tree will sue you, she had teased. Maybe it should, he'd answered, if it ever stops growing. Now, decades later, the tree still grew, and he wondered if Ellen had somehow planned it that way to outlive their mistakes, to remind him that some roots were meant to hold. The next morning, Emma called. Grandpa, I forgot to give you the soup I made. I'll drop it by tomorrow. He smiled into the receiver. Make sure it's still hot when you get here. I will. You okay? Robert hesitated, glancing at the lemon tree again. I think I'm about to start remembering properly, he said. After she hung up, he sat at the table, steam curling from his fresh cup of tea. For the first time in months, he felt awake. Outside, the rain had stopped. The lemon tree stood still, shining under the morning light, waiting. Would you hold your ground when everyone tells you to give up? The rain came again, softer this time, wrapping the house in a familiar hush. Robert stood by the window, his hand resting on the cool glass. The lemon tree swayed gently, and for a moment he could almost see Ellen there, thin hands brushing soil from her palms, laughing at something he'd said 40 years ago. He closed his eyes, and the years folded back. It had been 1983 when they moved into the house. The neighborhood wasn't much then, just gravel roads, half-built homes, and a horizon that looked unfinished. Robert was 28, an engineer with more plans than money, and Ellen was 26, a schoolteacher who believed in small miracles. They had bought the house because no one else wanted it. The roof leaked, the floor tilted, and the garden was a patch of stubborn weeds. But when Ellen stepped through the door, she smiled. It's perfect, she'd said. It just needs a reason to stay standing. That night, after unpacking boxes and eating canned soup by candlelight, she brought out a clay pot wrapped in newspaper. Inside was a fragile lemon sapling. I took it from California, she said shyly, from the motel where we stayed after the wedding. Robert laughed. You stole a tree borrowed, she corrected. If it grows here, our marriage will too. So they planted it the next morning, digging through the hard Oregon soil until their hands blistered. They argued over where to place it. Ellen wanted sun. Robert wanted shelter. In the end, they found a spot between both, just like everything else in their life. Years passed. The tree grew, and so did they. Every spring, Ellen would hang small ribbons from its branches, yellow for joy, white for peace, blue for hope. Robert used to tease her for it, but after a while he found himself doing it too. Their life was never grand. Vacations meant picnics by the coast. Anniversaries meant lemon pie and old records. But it was theirs. The memory shifted. The colors grew dimmer, the laughter quieter. He remembered the hospital smell, the cold tile floors. Ellen's hands had grown thin, her breath shallow. The illness came like a thief silent. At first, then unstoppable. One evening, as rain tapped against the window beside her bed, she asked him, "Do you think the tree will outlive us?" "I hope so," he said. "It's better at surviving than I am." Ellen smiled weakly. "Good. Because I'm leaving you something to remind you of that." She reached into the drawer of her bedside table and took out a small envelope. Across the front in her steady handwriting was a single word: independence. "Don't open it yet," she said. "Not until they try to make you forget who you are." He didn't understand then, not fully. He only knew she looked too tired to argue. So he took her hand and said, "I promise I'll keep the house." "No," she whispered. "Keep the roots." That night he stayed awake beside her, listening to her breathing fade into the sound of the rain. When dawn came, the rain stopped and a single lemon blossom had opened on the branch outside the hospital window. After her funeral, Robert came home and found the tree covered in tiny white flowers. He'd taken it as her last message that some things once planted never really die. He touched the window pane, now watching the reflection of his older face blur against the garden light. "Still keeping your promise," he murmured. The wind carried the scent of lemons through the open crack of the window. For a moment he thought he heard her voice again, soft, amused, eternal. Robert lingered at the window long after the memory faded. The garden shimmered with dew, each droplet catching the weak sunlight, like fragments of the past refusing to dissolve. He thought about David as a boy, how he used to run through that same garden, barefoot chasing butterflies Ellen pretended to protect. There had been laughter, then uncomplicated and loud. But time, like the rain, had a way of washing color from things. Now his son only visited to negotiate his words as sharp as contracts. Robert wondered when care had turned into calculation. He reached out, pressing his palm against the cold glass. "I wish you'd seen what we became, Ellen," he said softly. "Maybe you'd know how to fix it." Outside, the lemon tree shivered, and somewhere beneath the roots he imagined her answering. "Not everything broken needs fixing," her voice might have said. "Some things just need remembering." He turned away from the window, the echo of her imagined voice steadying him. Tomorrow he thought he would start remembering differently. 3 weeks passed before Robert heard from David again. The silence had almost felt like peace until the SUV returned. This time it wasn't just David and Marianne stepping out. A young man in a gray suit followed them, his leather briefcase swinging at his side like a verdict waiting to be read. Robert was pruning the lemon tree when they approached. He didn't look up until he heard the familiar false cheer in his son's voice. "Dad." "Hope we're not interrupting. You always are," Robert said calmly, wiping his hands on his flannel shirt. "Who's the boy?" "This is Charles Mayfield," David said quickly. "He's a legal consultant, just here to help clarify some paperwork for you." "Paperwork," Robert repeated. "What for? I haven't asked for any help." Marianne's tone came, sweet, too sweet. "We just thought we'd make things easier. Charles here will explain." The young man smiled, rehearsed and polite. "Mr. Hale, your son and daughter-in-law are concerned about your well-being. We're suggesting a temporary transfer of management just to protect your interests in case of emergencies. You'd retain residence, of course." Robert's gaze sharpened. "You mean power of attorney?" Charles hesitated. "A limited one. And who gets the power? Your son." "Temporarily." Robert laughed softly, the kind of laugh that cut. "You want me to sign away my name so you can protect me from myself?" David sighed, shifting impatiently. "Dad, don't make this dramatic. It's just paperwork. Everyone does this when they get older." "I see," Robert said. "And what happens when I stop agreeing with you? Does the paperwork handle that too?" "Why do you always assume the worst?" David snapped. "Because I raised you," Robert answered. For a moment no one spoke. Even the lemon tree seemed to hold its breath. Marianne broke the silence. "We're only trying to help you simplify your life by taking it apart one signature at a time," Robert said. The lawyer cleared his throat. Mr. Hale, this is standard procedure. You can read the terms, of course. He opened the briefcase and slid a document across the patio table. The crisp pages looked surgical detached. Robert didn't touch them. If my wife were alive, she'd tell you what that tree means to me, he said, glancing toward the garden. You think I'd let anyone cut it down without asking? David frowned. No one's cutting down your tree, Dad. Don't twist this, then stop twisting the word care into control. Robert replied. Charles looked between them, clearly uncomfortable. Maybe I should come back another time. You won't need to, Robert said. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded paper. I had a lawyer once, too. Graham Bishop. He taught me to read fine print before trusting family smiles. Marianne's expression hardened. Are you implying we'd cheat you? I'm implying you don't know the difference between helping and taking. David's jaw tightened. If you want to live alone and die alone, fine. But don't expect us to clean up afterward. Robert stood slow but steady. If you think I'm afraid of dying alone, you don't know me at all. I've already buried everything that mattered. Marianne gathered her purse. This conversation is going nowhere. Exactly where you wanted it, Robert said. They turned and walked toward the car. The lawyer trailed behind, silent. Robert stayed by the lemon tree, watching the wind push through the leaves like breath through lungs. When the car engine started, he whispered, Still standing, Ellen, still standing. That evening the phone rang again. He almost ignored it, expecting another argument, but the voice on the line was warm, gravelly, and familiar. Robert Hale, the man, said, This is Graham Bishop. Got your message. Didn't think I'd ever hear from you again. Neither did I, Robert said. You still remember how to outwit a snake? Depends on the size of the snake, Graham replied. Yours got family ties, unfortunately. Then I'll bring the big stick. Graham chuckled. See you tomorrow. Robert hung up and exhaled. For the first time in months, he felt something close to relief. Not because he trusted the system, but because someone else still remembered how to fight fair. He walked out to the porch where the last rays of sunlight stretched thin across the yard. The lemon tree cast a long shadow reaching almost to his feet. Tomorrow, he told it quietly, we start pruning differently. The next morning brought a hard light, thin and white, spilling across the table where Robert waited. At exactly 9, a slow knock rattled the door. When he opened it, there stood Graham Bishop, older, heavier, but carrying the same sharp eyes that once cut through courtroom noise like glass. Still breathing, Graham said, stepping inside. And still making trouble, I hear. Robert smiled faintly. Trouble has a way of remembering my address. Graham dropped his leather case on the counter and looked around the room. Same curtains, same cat, same smell of tea. I'd say time hasn't changed you. Time's been polite enough to knock. Robert replied. They sat at the kitchen table. Graham spread the documents David had left behind, his fingers tracing each line. Classic maneuver, he said. Temporary management writes my ass. They'd get full control of your assets within 6 months. I figured as much, Robert murmured. Graham looked up. You called me because you already have an answer, not because you need one. What are you planning? Robert leaned back. To keep a promise. The two men spent hours going through old files, deeds, letters, tax slips, all the dusty proof of a life built slowly and defended quietly. When Graham found the original ownership record, his brow lifted. Well, I'll be damned. Ellen co-signed this deed. Robert nodded. She insisted. That means Graham continued tapping the page. Half this house automatically went into joint survivorship. When she passed, you inherited her share, but if you've got a living heir registered on her side, it's not theirs to sell without consent. Robert frowned. Meaning Emma? Meaning Emma, Graham said with a grin. You give her partial ownership, they can't touch a single nail without her signature. Robert stared at the lemon tree through the window. She's young. I didn't want her dragged into this mess. She already is. Graham said gently. They'll drag her whether you name her or not. Might as well give her armor. That evening, Robert and Emma met at the notary office. She listened quietly as Graham explained the transfer. So, this makes me co-owner? She asked. Yes, Robert said, but it's not for spending, it's for standing. Emma nodded slowly. Then I'll stand. She signed the papers with careful strokes. When they stepped outside, the sun had already dipped below the skyline. Portland's lights flickered to life like stars unsure of their place. Robert put a hand on her shoulder. Your grandmother would have liked you, you know. Emma smiled. Then I'll try to deserve it. A week later, David called again, angrier this time. Dad, what the hell did you do? Good morning to you too, Robert replied. Don't play games. The bank froze our account today. They said someone filed a restriction notice on the house title. Are you trying to ruin us? Robert held the phone to his ear and walked to the garden. Funny, I thought you were trying to ruin me. This isn't funny, David shouted. Do you have any idea what you've done? I've kept a roof over my head, Robert said evenly. You're senile. Robert smiled, and yet apparently still smarter than your lawyer. David hung up without another word. The silence afterward felt like oxygen. 2 days later, Robert went to the bank to withdraw some savings. The teller's polite smile faltered when she pulled up his account. I'm sorry, Mr. Hale, she said. There seems to be a temporary hold, something to do with pending verification. He blinked. Verification of what I'm not authorized to say. He understood immediately. David and Marianne had used their partial access to freeze his funds, hoping to force him to yield. The humiliation burned, but only for a moment. Then it cooled into clarity. He thanked the teller, stepped outside, and stood under the gray sky. The city hummed around him, cars, voices, the smell of rain. He'd lived too long to be surprised by betrayal, but it still carried weight when it came from your own blood. As he walked home, he stopped at a florist's stand and bought a single lemon blossom from a vase. The vendor frowned. That one's ornamental, sir. Doesn't last long. That's all right, Robert said, handing her a few bills. Neither do promises. When he returned home, Graham was waiting on the porch, hat-tilted folder in hand. They froze your accounts, Graham asked. They did. Good. That means they're desperate, Robert chuckled. I'm glad someone finds this entertaining. Graham handed him a new folder. This here's the counterstrike. I filed the title transfer for Emma this morning. Once it's processed, not even the governor could force a sale without her consent. Robert exhaled slowly. Thank you, Graham. Don't thank me. Thank Ellen for marrying a man stubborn enough to outlive common sense. They laughed quietly. The sound wasn't joy, it was survival. As evening crept in, the two old men sat on the porch, listening to the faint rustle of the lemon tree. She'd be proud, Graham said. Maybe Robert answered. Or maybe she'd tell me to stop fighting ghosts. Graham smirked. Then she should have left fewer of them. The wind stirred again, carrying the scent of lemons and rain. Robert lifted his teacup toward the tree as though to toast someone unseen. To ghosts, he said softly. The only witnesses who never lie. The following Sunday carried the kind of silence that warns of a storm. Robert knew they would come. People like David didn't disappear quietly, they regrouped. At noon, the SUV pulled into the driveway again. David got out first, jaw-tight, phone in hand. Marianne followed, wearing the same kind of confidence one buys with desperation. Behind them came Charles, the young lawyer, looking less polished than before. Robert waited for them in the living room. He'd opened the curtains wide so the lemon tree outside was clearly visible through the window, his quiet witness. David didn't bother with greetings. We need to talk. I assume so, Robert said, motioning toward the chairs. You brought an audience again. Charles started softly, as if to diffuse tension. Mr. and Hale, I understand there's been some misunderstanding about property rights. There's no misunderstanding, Robert interrupted. Only a discovery. David folded his arms. You tricked me. You transferred ownership without telling anyone. Robert leaned back in his chair. Tricked, no. I just remembered that trust must be earned, not assumed. Marianne's tone was icy. You've turned our daughter against us. Emma turned herself toward honesty, Robert replied. There's a difference. She's a child, Marianne snapped. She doesn't know what she's doing. Robert's eyes hardened. She knew what she was doing the moment you made her cry for choosing to visit me. The room went still. David's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. You think you've won, but this isn't over. We can challenge this transfer in court. You're not mentally fit to make such decisions. Robert's expression didn't change. If you believe that, then file it, David hesitated. We will. Good, Robert said. Because I'd hate for this to end quietly. Charles shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps we can find a civil resolution. Robert turned to him. Charles, I don't blame you. Everyone's got to make rent. But next time, read who you're representing before you sit at their table. The young man flushed. I'm just following orders. Robert finished for him. I used to say the same thing when I was your age. It sounded better before I knew what those words meant. Marianne rose, her voice trembling between anger and panic. Do you realize what you're doing? You're destroying this family. This family, Robert said slowly, was destroyed the moment love became collateral. You're being dramatic. David hissed. I'm being accurate. Marianne turned to Charles. Say something. He's manipulating this. Charles looked at her, then back at Robert. Mrs. Hale, legally the deed is valid. The transaction was properly notarized. David slammed his hand on the table. You're fired. Charles gathered his papers. I was never really hired. He left without another word. The house fell quiet again. The ticking clock filled the air between them. Robert stood, his movements slow but deliberate, and walked toward the cabinet near the fireplace. He opened the drawer and pulled out a small black device. David frowned. What's that, a memory? Robert said. One that doesn't fade when people start rewriting the truth. He pressed play. The room filled with the echo of their previous conversation. David's impatient tone, Marianne's calculated persuasion, Charles's hesitant approval. Every sentence a confession of pressure, coercion, and greed. On the recording, David's voice snapped, You're not getting any younger. Sign it before we have to make decisions for you. Marianne added, This house isn't sacred. It's an investment. The sound ended. Silence returned louder than before. David's face turned white. You recorded us? Robert met his eyes. No, the house did. What the hell does that mean? It means some things listen longer than people do, Robert said. Ellen built this place with me. Every wall, every screw, every board remembers her voice. You thought you could turn it into currency. I thought I'd remind you it still speaks. Marianne's voice broke. You can't use that. It's illegal. I don't need to, Robert said quietly. I just needed you to hear yourselves. David paced the room like a caged animal. You think you're clever, but you've made enemies of your own blood. When you're gone, there'll be nothing left for anyone. Robert looked through the window at the lemon tree. Good. Maybe it'll finally rest. You'll regret this, David said. I already do, Robert replied. Not because of what I've done, but because of what you became. For a moment, David seemed to soften, but Marianne grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door. Let's go, she said. He's beyond saving. The door slammed behind them, leaving the house humming with the quiet aftermath of truth. Robert stood there for a long time. He could still hear the faint echo of their voices on the recording like ghosts arguing in another room. Then he reached down, switched it off, and placed the device inside a small box labeled Ellen's Things. He went to the porch and sat beneath the lemon tree. The wind carried the smell of citrus and rain. Somewhere a bird began to sing. He whispered, Still standing, my love, but the roots are shaking. Would you fight for truth even if it means losing your family? The house had never been so quiet. 3 days passed since the confrontation, and yet the air still felt heavy as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Robert moved slowly through each room, dusting shelves that hadn't been touched in months, picking up objects he couldn't quite throw away. Ellen's scarf still hung on the coat rack near the door, faintly smelling of lavender. Her reading glasses lay in a small porcelain dish beside the bed. The smallest things refused to vanish, even when the people who owned them were gone. He opened the window to let in air. The lemon tree outside shimmered under the pale afternoon sun, its leaves trembling lightly. He stared at it for a long while. You held better than I did, he murmured. You never forgot what you were growing for. A breeze drifted in, carrying a faint citrus scent that filled the room like an answer. That night, Robert sat by the kitchen table with a pot of tea and an old photo album. The pages had begun to curl at the edges, each photograph fading into softer shades. There was David at age 5, standing in front of the tree with a toy shovel. There was Ellen behind him, laughing as she tried to keep dirt off her dress. He smiled faintly, then closed his eyes. The memory was sharp and warm at first, then heavy. He could still hear his own voice back then, stern and too loud. You can't plant a tree with a toy shovel, son. Let me do it. David's small voice had quivered, but I want to help. Ellen had stepped in, brushing soil from her hands. Let him. Roots grow better when they're shared. Robert exhaled. Maybe that was the moment it had all started, his need to control, to protect too tightly until love began to feel like pressure. Now, decades later, he could still see David's face in that moment, hurt, confused, trying to please a father who had already decided how things should be done. He rose and walked into the living room where the clock ticked steadily against the quiet. Moss, the cat, followed him halfway and stopped curling at the doorway. Robert sat down and stared at the faint reflection of the lemon tree in the glass. I keep thinking, he said softly, maybe it wasn't greed. Maybe he just didn't learn the language of keeping things alive. The tree rustled outside as if disagreeing. He smiled bitterly. No, you're right. He learned it. He just forgot the meaning. The phone rang once that evening, a number he didn't recognize. He didn't answer. The world could wait. Later in the study, he took out a blank sheet of paper and began to write. His handwriting was slow, deliberate, every word heavy with both sorrow and calm. To Emma. I'm leaving this in the drawer where the Independence envelope once was. I think your grandmother would want you to have both. People will tell you I kept the house out of pride. That isn't true. I kept it because memory needs walls and love needs something to echo in. Don't hate your father. He's not cruel, he's afraid. Afraid of being small, of losing what he never really owned. We all have our fears. Mine was forgetting who we were before bitterness arrived. When the time comes and the lemon tree stops blooming, don't cry. Just take one of its branches, plant it wherever you live, and let it grow. Roots don't belong to places, they belong to choices. He paused, then added a final line. Remember, love doesn't need witnesses. It just needs someone to listen. He folded the letter neatly, slid it into an envelope, and sealed it. The night stretched long. Robert sat on the porch beneath the lemon tree, wrapped in his coat. The moonlight painted the garden silver, soft enough to forgive the years. He thought of Ellen again, her laughter, her patience, the way she would hum while hanging ribbons on the branches. He whispered into the wind. You were right. It's not about owning anything. It's about belonging somewhere. A lemon dropped from above, rolling to his feet. He picked it up, the skin cool and fragrant, and smiled. Still listening, aren't you? The horizon glowed faintly, the first sign of dawn. Somewhere a neighbor's dog barked, and the ordinary sounds of life began again. Inside, the clock kept ticking steady and sure, as if promising that time could still move forward. Robert leaned back, eyes half closed. For the first time in years, he felt something close to forgiveness. Not for them, not even for himself, but for everything that had simply gone wrong along the way. He whispered one last time toward the open sky, Ellen. I think I finally understand what you meant by roots. The lemon tree rustled, scattering pale petals across his shoulders. And for a brief, impossible moment, he thought he felt her hand there, warm, steady, wordless. Would you forgive those who forgot what love once built? Morning came gently, the kind of light that doesn't demand to be noticed. Robert woke to the sound of rain easing off the roof, the smell of wet earth drifting through the open window. For a moment he didn't remember the arguments, the recordings, the silence, only the rhythm of drops against leaves. He made coffee instead of tea that morning, a small rebellion against routine. Moss wound around his legs, purring softly, asking for nothing but presence. Robert smiled and reached down to scratch the cat's chin. The phone rang again. This time it was Emma. Grandpa. I just wanted to check in, she said. Mom's been quiet. Dad, too. That's progress, Robert said gently. I don't like how things ended, Emma admitted. It feels wrong. It will, he said. Truth usually does, but give it time. Even storms water something. There was a pause. Are you okay? He looked out at the lemon tree. Overnight, a few new blossoms had appeared, tiny, white, fragile things catching the morning sun. I think the tree's forgiven us, he said. So yes, I'm all right. Emma laughed softly. Then maybe we all will. Maybe, he echoed. After she hung up, Robert stayed by the window. He watched the blossoms tremble, the petals shining like quiet apologies. He whispered, Roots don't judge, do they? They just keep holding. The lemon tree swayed, answering in silence. And for the first time in a long while, the silence felt kind. The letter arrived on the Thursday morning, tucked between utility bills and a grocery flyer. The envelope was cream-colored, its edges slightly worn, the handwriting unfamiliar yet elegant. It had traveled a long way. Lisbon, Portugal. Robert brought it to the kitchen table, poured himself tea, and opened it with the same caution one gives to something fragile. Inside was a single page and a small folded document stamped with a foreign notary seal. Dear Mr. Hale, my name is Anna Silva. I believe you were the husband of Ellen Hale. We met years ago when she traveled to Portugal for her research grant. Before she returned home, she asked me to keep a sealed envelope for her, one that was to be delivered to you if she ever passed before you. It seems time has finally asked me to fulfill that promise. Please know that your wife was one of the gentlest souls I ever knew. She spoke of you and of a house filled with lemon light. The enclosed document belongs to you. She said it would make sense only when you were ready to stop fighting ghosts. With respect, Anna Silva. Robert unfolded the second sheet. It was a notarized certificate dated nearly 25 years earlier, confirming a modest but significant overseas account jointly held under Ellen and Robert Hale. His name was there in faded ink, already waiting. He sat back, stunned. Ellen had prepared for this long before her illness, perhaps even before the arguments with David began. She had always thought ahead quietly, gently, without boasting about her wisdom. Robert exhaled the air trembling from his chest. You always knew, didn't you? Outside, the lemon tree swayed. That afternoon he returned to his study and opened the drawer where Ellen's independence letter rested. The old paper crackled softly as if sighing. He read it again, slower this time. If they ever try to take the house, remember it's more than bricks. It's proof that love leaves roots. But beneath those words now, he could almost hear her voice, different, deeper. You were never meant to protect the house, Robert, she whispered in his memory. You were meant to protect what it stood for. He closed his eyes and the years folded inward. Every moment of defiance, every word spoken in anger, every night of solitude, they all condensed into one quiet truth. Ellen hadn't built the house to last forever. She'd built it to teach him how to let go without losing himself. A laugh escaped him, half joy, half disbelief. You clever woman, he murmured. You didn't trust me to figure it out until now. The sound of wind drifted in through the open window, brushing the curtains aside like a hand across his shoulder. The scent of lemons filled the air again. As the sun sank lower, Robert sat at the table with a new sheet of paper and began writing once more. To David and Marianne, you'll receive this when I'm gone, or maybe sooner depending on how brave I feel tomorrow. I don't write this to accuse or to forgive. I write it because silence like dust gathers fast in empty rooms. This house has never been about money. Your mother and I bought it when we couldn't afford anything but faith. Every board here carries her laughter, every nail her patience. If you ever wondered what made her stay through my worst years, it was this place. It gave her space to grow things, even me. You wanted to sell it because you thought it trapped me. In truth, it was the only thing keeping me free. When you look at this house again, maybe years from now, I hope you'll see more than its walls. I hope you'll see the two young fools who planted a lemon tree just to see if love could survive Oregon winters. He stopped, smiling faintly. It did, he whispered. Then he kept writing. I'm leaving the key on the table. It doesn't mean I'm surrendering it to you. It means I'm trusting you to remember. Don't tear it down. Don't turn it into profit. Just let it breathe. One day when Emma brings her children here, tell them the truth. Their great-grandmother grew a lemon tree from a stolen sapling and a stubborn heart. That's the story worth keeping. Take care of each other, even when you don't deserve each other. That's what families do. He folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and wrote their names on the front, his handwriting unsteady but sure. Then he took the old brass key from his pocket and set it beside the envelope. Evening descended in amber light. Robert stepped onto the porch with his tea and looked at the horizon. The sun was sinking directly behind the lemon tree, painting the leaves gold. The air shimmered, and for a fleeting second he thought he saw Ellen standing beneath the branches, ribbons fluttering around her. He didn't speak. He only raised his cup slightly, a toast without words. You win, he said finally, his voice soft but steady. You always did. The wind answered in a low sigh, rustling through the tree like applause. He sat back, letting the light wash over him. In that moment, the house no longer felt like a fortress or a cage. It felt like a story nearing its last peaceful page. And for once, he wasn't afraid of how it would end. The next morning arrived with a strange stillness, too quiet for spring, too calm for endings. Robert woke before dawn, his breath visible in the cool air. He moved through the house, slowly touching the walls as though saying goodbye without words. The letter for David and Marianne lay sealed on the table beside the brass key. Another envelope, smaller, was addressed to Emma. He'd written her name in steady letters, the kind a man uses when he wants something to last. He poured himself a final cup of tea, the steam curling upward like memory. Outside, the lemon tree shimmered beneath a faint mist, its branches heavy with fruit. It looked almost luminous. For a moment, he thought about calling Graham or even Emma. But the quiet felt right, like the pause before a heartbeat, like the breath before music begins. He took his coat and stepped out onto the porch. The boards creaked beneath his feet, each sound familiar, comforting. He whispered, "You've done your job, old friend," as if the house itself could hear. By noon, the mailman noticed the open gate and an envelope pinned to the porch rail. It bore a single line in neat handwriting. "For those who still listen." Inside were 3 pages. The first a note: "To whoever finds this, don't call it a goodbye. I've lived my story. Now the house will tell the rest." The second was the deed transfer finalized that morning, granting joint stewardship of the property to Emma and a local historical trust. The third was a quote copied from Ellen's old notebook: "Some walls keep people out. Ours kept love in." The mailman hesitated, uncertain whether to step closer. Through the window, the house looked undisturbed, peaceful. The kettle sat cold on the stove. A cup waited beside it, half full, still warm. Emma arrived 2 hours later, breathless from the drive. She called his name as soon as she stepped inside. "Grandpa." The silence answered first. Then the faint sound of the wind brushing through the lemon tree. She found the note on the table, the keys beside it. The sunlight spilled through the window, catching the edge of the paper. She unfolded it carefully, her hands trembling. "Emma, by the time you read this, I'll be where your grandmother's laughter still echoes. The house is yours now, not to own, but to keep breathing. Let it be what it's always been, a place that remembers. Tell your father I'm proud of him, even if he never asks why. Tell him he was wrong, but that wrongness doesn't define him. People grow crooked before they grow strong. And when you walk past the lemon tree, look down. There's a small box buried near its roots. Inside is what Ellen left behind: a little money, a lot of love, and a photograph of the 3 of us. Bury the photo again after you see it. Let it stay where it belongs." Voices fade, but guilt echoes louder. Emma pressed the paper to her chest. The house was utterly still, except for the faint ticking of the clock and the hum of wind through the open door. She stepped outside. The lemon tree swayed gently, petals falling like pale snow. She followed the directions, kneeling at the base of the trunk. The soil gave way easily. Inside a small tin box wrapped in oilcloth, she found a photograph: Ellen, Robert, and a young David, smiling beneath the tree ribbons fluttering above them. Tears blurred the edges. She reburied it carefully, pressing the soil flat with her hands. When she looked up, a lemon dropped from the highest branch, rolling to her feet. She picked it up, held it close, and whispered, "I'll keep it breathing, Grandpa." The wind rose softly, circling the yard like a sigh. The house creaked once, just once, as if acknowledging her promise. That evening, as dusk settled over Portland, the lemon tree glowed gold in the fading light. From the street, neighbors said it looked almost alive, like it was listening. And in that quiet, where grief and peace touched for a moment, a single petal drifted down onto the porch steps, resting beside a cup of cold tea. Would you fight to keep love alive, even after you're gone?